This week, the green industrial revolution.
One of the core issues with green steel is fundamentally more expensive to make than polluting steel.
Steel is a vital ingredient for many green technologies, but its production burns billions of tons of coal each year. How can the industry clean itself up?
What goes into your recycling bin at home, more than 80% is actually being landfilled or incinerated.
Super product, ecological nightmare. We take a look at the plastic problem and two companies trying to solve it.
Few have realized that meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement isn't just about advancing clean energy or capturing carbon dioxide from the air. The world will also have to find ways to keep most fossil fuel reserves in the ground.
And from border taxes to outright bans, government and regulators are stepping up the war on carbon emissions, all in the pursuit of net zero. I'm Kaylee Lines in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green. The green revolution is being built on steel and concrete, but there's a big problem. Together, those two industries make up more than 10% of global greenhouse emissions. Steel is also currently responsible for almost a third of coal use, burning billions and billions of tons a year. So what needs to be done to turn a dirty steel industry green? Bloomberg's Eddie Spence explains why weaning it off cheap coal will require massive government support and concerted action by steelmakers around the world.
The green revolution is being built on a very dirty industry. Steel is critical in almost every single decarbonisation technology there is, be it wind turbines, solar panels, or electricity pylons. The problem is, its production burns billions of tons of coal every year. In fact, the steel industry each year emits more CO2 than all the buses, cars, and motorbikes on the planet. According to BNEF forecasts, to build enough wind turbines to reach net zero by 2050 would require 1.5 billion tons of steel. That's enough to build over 42,000 Burj Khalifas. So what does that mean for the steel industry? It means it's going to have to decarbonise, and fast. It's a huge task because the industry is currently dominated by coal-fired blast furnaces, which emit huge amounts of CO2. Steelmakers are currently exploring two main ways of replacing these. The first is to substitute the coal with biomass and then trap the emissions it produces underground. ArcelorMittal, Europe's biggest steelmaker, is one of the companies looking at doing this. It's an appealing option because it avoids having to do costly retrofits of all the existing blast furnaces. The problem is, this solution isn't necessarily scalable. There simply isn't that much biomass around, and a lot of other industries want it. For example, the aerospace for biofuel. Another option is replacing coal with green hydrogen, which, when used to make steel, will emit only water, making it an inferior greener option. It's also infinitely scalable. So long as you have enough electricity, you can make green hydrogen. One of the companies looking at doing this is SSAB. They're currently in the process of building plants that will run on hydrogen. The problem is, using green hydrogen will require incredibly costly retrofits of all the steel plants. There also isn't that much of it today, simply because the industry almost doesn't exist yet to produce it. All ways of decarbonising the steel industry involve massive costs and huge technical barriers, but there is some hope. Some of the world's biggest steel companies have now committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050, including ArcelorMittal in Europe, Nippon Steel in Japan, and most importantly, the Chinese state-owned giant Baowu Steel. That's incredibly important because China produces over 50% of the world's steel. Unless China decarbonises, all the efforts of Western steelmakers will be for almost nothing. One of the core issues with green steel is that it is fundamentally more expensive to make than polluting steel. That means that governments have to provide incentives to steelmakers to produce it. Finally, they're starting to do so. The EU Green Deal, set to be announced in July, is likely to contain measures to promote production of green steel. For example, tariffs on foreign polluting imports, as well as high carbon prices to make green steel production more viable. Without measures like these, the decarbonisation of the steel industry simply won't happen, and there will be huge costs for the planet.
Residential energy usage accounts for roughly 20% of greenhouse emissions in the United States. But what if there was a construction method that cut that by a factor of 10? The concept of a passive house was created in the early 90s. It is now a global standard that encompasses any type of building and can result in up to 70 to 90% less carbon emissions. But my next guest says the sector must make a larger contribution to tackle climate change. Many national construction standards still permit energy consumption that is much too high. Joining me now is Professor Wolfgang Feist, founder of the Passive House Institute. Professor, thank you so much for being here. First, what defines a passive house?
Well, you just said it. It's a way to construct buildings so that you consume almost no heating energy. Because if you have a factor 10, that is almost nothing. So you can provide this heating by anything which is available just everywhere. So, for example, we can do it with the existing electrical grid.
Of course, Passive House started 30 years ago, the Passive House Institute 25 years ago. What is different today than when you started?
Well, when we started, nothing of the components you need to build a passive house have been available on the market. And nowadays we have industrialized production of these components. For example, the triple pane glazes, for example, the insulated frames, the heat recovery systems with an efficiency in a range of 90%. They are available now on the market, so it's much easier to build a passive house right now than it was 30 years ago.
Could you foresee a future where every house is a passive house?
Well, you could at least use the components everywhere. And of course, in new construction, it's quite easy to build to passive house standard. But the most important thing nowadays for the developed countries, like United States or Germany, are the existing buildings. So we have to improve the existing buildings to reduce their energy demand to somehow a quarter or something like that. So it's possible to use the passive house components here, but in most cases, we won't reach passive housing. But in some we do. There is a good example in New York, actually, a brownstone house in Brooklyn, which has been retrofitted to be passive house. So it's not impossible, but in most cases, we will just save, say, half the energy or 3/4 of the energy, but that is efficient enough to be able to go to a sustainable energy development.
All right, thank you so much to Professor Wolfgang Feist, founder of the Passive House Institute. Coming up, almost 8% of oil pumped every year goes into the creation of just one type of product: plastic. The 20th century's everlasting super material is now at the center of the climate crisis. We look at two companies trying to make a change. This is Bloomberg Green.
I'm Madison Mills in New York, and this is your Green Brief. Paris and London are competing to dominate the burgeoning world of green finance and the trillions of dollars in deals that it'll bring. The French capital is currently home to more green fund assets, but London has been catching up in recent quarters. Bloomberg Intelligence estimates that ESG investments could have more than $53 trillion of assets by 2025. China's top economic planning body has been put in charge of cutting greenhouse gases. The National Development and Reform Commission will chart a broad plan for reducing emissions. With solar manufacturing costs hitting a plateau recently, producers are working to generate more electricity from the same size farm. Grid-sized solar farms are now typically cheaper than coal or even gas-fired plants, but more savings are necessary to meet the cost of expensive storage technology that's required for 24/7 carbon-free power. Satellite data shows a massive plume of methane about 90 kilometers east of Taiwan and China's biggest coal-producing region. The country's latest 5-year plan included a pledge for the first time to contain methane emissions. And that is your Green Brief.
Plastic is both a super product and an ecological nightmare. It's cheap, durable, and won't rot, which means it's great for shopping bags and fast food, but not so great for turtles or the environment. It also means it will stick around for hundreds of years. But the problem with plastic is that when it's exposed to the elements, it releases greenhouse gases like methane, which can be 28 times as warming as CO2. So what's the solution? We took a look at two small companies making products that are trying to change the way we think about using and disposing of materials.
Our addiction to plastic is catastrophic. Remnants of our products have spread to every corner of the planet. The properties that make plastic so useful, cheap, malleable, durable, also make it damaging. Plastic can't degrade, so the more we make, the more ends up in our environment.
What goes into your recycling bin at home, more than 80% is actually being landfilled or incinerated.
It pollutes the water we drink and the food we eat. It suffocates wildlife.
I don't think anybody anticipated the real problems that plastics were causing.
But innovative companies around the world are working towards a solution. Plastic waste is a global problem, but it's especially bad in certain parts of Asia.
Plastic waste issue in Thailand is quite bad. We use a lot of plastic bag and plastic container. You just use a single-use plastic because it's more convenient.
Thailand is one of 5 Asian countries that, combined, contribute more than the rest of the world to the plastic waste in our oceans. These countries are experiencing rapid economic growth. With that comes the benefit of growing consumption, but also the increasing use of plastic, especially single-use plastics like shopping bags, straws and food packaging, which are often tossed away just minutes after buying. But what if these sorts of products didn't have to be made from plastic at all?
For anything that you only use for one time, biodegradable material could be a better choice. We are producing biodegradable packaging. Our packaging are made out of cassava starch and natural fiber together. It takes 6 to 12 months to decompose depending on the environment.
The cassava crop plays a major role in the Thai economy. It's not a staple food crop, but it's produced in vast amounts for animal feed and making things like starch.
The cassava is very easy to grow. You can grow all year round and in a lot of area in Thailand. My product can tolerate the temperature from -20 to 100 degrees. So with the hot food or with the boiling water, we still can contain that in our packaging. Our material can work as an insulation. It keeps the temperature of the food warmer longer than the other material.
The company, Universal Biopack, say they make around 100,000 items a month, mainly for hotels and restaurants with environmental concerns. Compared to plastic, their products aren't as malleable or durable and are at least twice as expensive. But using packaging like this could reduce the amount of single-use plastics we consume. So either these kinds of solutions will have to become cheaper to compete with plastic, or consumers will have to make a difficult choice.
Now our products are more expensive, but definitely it's better for the environment. People will have to think different way. Right now, if you pay for the plastic, you pay for only the cost of making the plastic. You don't pay for the cost of making the plastic go away because the plastic stay like 450 years.
On the other side of the world, a company is working on just that.
We need to find alternatives to burying our waste into the earth. Plastic Energy takes waste plastic that can't be recycled today and converts it into usable oils.
One of the biggest problems with plastics is how many different kinds there are. The majority of it can't actually be recycled, and many products use a mix of materials, which makes it even harder to recycle. It means most of what we think is recyclable ends up in the ground.
Mixed plastics is a real problem.
Plastic Energy is targeting these problematic plastics using technology called thermal anaerobic conversion. The company heats the plastic to 400 degrees Celsius in a system without oxygen. The plastic waste breaks down into an oil similar to petroleum extracted from the earth.
For every ton of plastic that we process, we produce around 700 litres of oil.
By converting plastic into a base oil, Plastic Energy is creating a virgin substance that can be used in many more products.
Some of those oils can be used to make plastic again, or can be used to make commodity fuels. But we can keep moving plastic waste into our facility through our process using our technology to produce the oils to produce plastics again, and that's a continual process. It doesn't have that finite life.
It's this IP that has helped the company give waste plastic value. It has agreements to build sites in Asia, and by building modular plants, they can attach to petrochemical companies who can use the oil they made from waste. While this process doesn't eradicate plastic, it could go a long way in reducing the amount that ends up in landfill or floating out to sea.
That material has value, and if it's dealt with in the right way, the material that it goes into the bin can actually arrive back on a shelf, wrapping in your local produce.
This circular economy could prevent more being made from fossil fuels in the first place. Companies like Plastic Energy and UBP have different ideas about how to tackle the plastic crisis. But what they share is a vision of the world where our throwaway culture is buried for good.
One thing is how we use the plastic or how we can recycle. Eco-friendly material could be another choice, but I think to overcome the plastic waste problem, we have to do both sides at the same time.
We don't have to make materials just from raw materials or materials extracted from the ground. We can really have a circular process across the board, not just plastics, but for all types of materials.
Coming up, the carbon crackdown. The route to net zero can't just advance clean energy or capture carbon from the air. It will also involve learning to leave fossil fuels in the ground. Up next, how governments are bending the emissions curve with carbon restrictions. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and this is Bloomberg Green. Well, we've looked at some of the technologies trying to take the CO2 out of big industry, but there's one common theme. There needs to be the backing of international organizations and governments. On the route to net zero, Akshat Rati took a look at some of the steps that are being taken to restrict carbon emissions.
Carbon restrictions are here to bend the emissions curve. In the science fiction novel, The Ministry for the Future, a devastating heatwave in India kills 20 million people and spurs the creation of a secretive group called the Children of Kali. The group sabotages fossil fuel-powered ships and planes, which forces countries and companies to adopt zero-carbon alternatives to keep the economy ticking. Even in fiction, however, violence isn't anyone's preferred way to beat climate change. But there is a larger point to the story. Few have realized that meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement isn't just about advancing clean energy or capturing carbon dioxide from the air. The world will also have to find ways to keep most fossil fuel reserves in the ground. That's the conclusion not just of climate activists, but also the International Energy Agency, whose entire aim is to secure the world's energy supplies and support economic growth. The easiest way to bring carbon restrictions is to deploy a carbon tax, which makes polluters pay. Some 40 countries in the world have such policies, but the tax is rarely high enough to make a serious dent in emissions. That's why many countries are turning to outright bans. Take 3 examples from just this year. California announced a ban on new fracking from 2024 and end all oil production by 2045. Denmark stopped giving new licenses for oil and gas exploration, with the existing production set to end by 2050. France passed a bill that will forbid conventional air travel if the journey can be made by train in less than 2.5 hours. These types of policies are adding to even bigger restrictions passed over the last few years. Many European countries are phasing out coal power plants. Multiple Californian cities have banned natural gas connections in new buildings. And more than 10 countries around the world have announced a ban on the sale of new gasoline-powered cars, with Norway's ban kicking in as soon as 2025. The European Union is even considering levying a carbon border tariff. If imported goods come from a country that does not levy an equivalent carbon price as the Europeans do, then a surcharge is added to ensure that the domestic industry does not suffer. One way or another, society will have to face up to the policies that keep a good chunk of fossil fuels in the ground, or pay the price in suffering that climate change will unleash. This is Net Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. Follow us on your favorite platforms for more.
Let's focus in now on Akshat's final point, the European Union's suggestion of carbon border tariffs. The EU is set to propose the levies on the 14th of July, targeting the emission costs on imports including steel, cement, and electricity. The move is designed to put the EU on a level footing with competitors in countries with weaker carbon policies. Our Brussels reporter Maria Tadeo is with us now for more. Maria, what's the thesis behind introducing these carbon border prices?
Yes, Kaylee, for the European Union, this is a huge project. The European Union is embarking on this huge Green Deal. This is really the cornerstone of European policy at this stage, and they want to cut down emissions majorly. They want to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. Now, of course, that means that you have to reduce those emissions coming from industries that are very intensive and they're also very high polluting. Now, the worry and their concern is that what we could see is companies and industries that decide to move away from the European Union to a country that has lower standards when it comes to the emissions. So what they're looking to do is to get this carbon border tax, which would essentially tax those imports from those very high polluting industries into the European Union. They're also looking to reduce some of the permits for the high polluting industries too, and make that to some extent a way to compete on a fair level between countries that may not be as ambitious as the European Union is on climate goals and the industries based here in Europe.
So what's the timeline? How quickly could we actually see these put into place?
Well, look, this is always a question mark when it comes to European Union policy. As you mentioned, July 14th, that is a key date for this potential piece of legislation. We are expecting the Commission to table this, and that will really kickstart the process. But as you know, the European Union works on three bases. You have the European Parliament, you have the executive branch, and then, of course, you have the European leaders that represent the national voters and the country. So they all need to agree on this, and it won't move until all of the European leaders agree. So that includes Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, but also some of the Eastern European countries that are also themselves wary about this transition. So, this is something that is not going to happen overnight, potentially not this year. But as I say, the European Union does want to have this done quickly in this commission so that they can start doing this from the period 2021 until 2030 and see that big reduction in emissions.
If and when Europe gets this done, is it going to put pressure on the rest of the world to follow their example?
Yeah, look, Kaylee, that's also what they argue. This isn't just about the industries and competing on a fair basis. This is also about the planet, and it's about climate, almost as a new identity shaping global politics and policy. So they do hope that those restrictions on an economic basis, the fact that you, in principle, would not get that competitive advantage if you do get that carbon tax, would entice countries like India or China, for that matter, to do more on the climate front.
All right, thanks so much to our Brussels reporter, Maria Tadeo. That's it for this week's edition, but keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lines in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.